For our next session, we'll do a deep dive on efforts to strengthen pathways to political power by rethinking the definition of what political power is. We're joined by two scholars from Rutgers University. First, Kira Sanbon-Matsu is professor of political science at Rutgers University and senior scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Her research interests include gender, race, ethnicity, parties, public opinion, and state politics. Her most recent book was co-authored with Kelly Dittmar and Susan J. Carroll, and it's A Seat at the Table, Congresswomen's Perspectives on Why Their Presence Matters. And she's joined today by her co-author, Kelly Dittmar. Kelly is an associate professor of political research at Rutgers University in Camden, and she's director of research and scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute. In addition to the book, A Seat at the Table, Kelly is also the author of Navigating Gendered Terrain, Stereotypes and Strategy in Political Campaigns, and her research focuses on gender and American political institutions. You can read their full bios on our website at nationalpress.org. So Kelly and Kira, thank you so much for joining us today, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. We are journalists' worst nightmare with those very long titles and multiple affiliations. We know, we apologize. So I'm Kelly Dittmar. I'm going to start us off talking a little bit about COP itself. Hopefully a lot of you are already familiar, but I want to walk a little bit through our website and resources because it feels like this is the audience that might be most interested. And then I will go into our most recent research projects, Rethinking Women's Political Power, which I'll talk about, and then Kira will talk about her incredible research on gender, money, and politics. So I'm going to start out just to give you the overview. This is all in our kind of background on the organization. I should say our director, Debbie Walsh, is in the back of the room, as well as our director of communications, Daniel DeSimone. So these are good people for you to know. So COP is a unit of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers. We're really nationally recognized as a leading scholarly resource on both research and data on women's political participation, candidates, office holders, voters. Our mission is to promote greater knowledge and understanding about the role of women in American politics, enhance women's influence in public life, and expand the diversity of women in politics and government. And then we also engage in research translation into programmatic work. So we have our new leadership program for college students, as well as ready-to-run campaign training programs. Those are both in New Jersey and in partner organizations in some of the states that you all come from, as well as other states throughout the country. And then we have a program called Teach a Girl to Lead, which is also an engaged program that is trying to change what young people think of when they think about public leadership. So first, I just want to, as I said, walk a little bit through our website. So this is just our main page of the website, and I'm going to put you to three different parts of it that I think are probably most relevant. So if you go to our facts page first, the thing that you might use probably the most is just going to the current numbers, kind of like where are we today? This page includes numbers on women office holders for federal, congressional, statewide executive, state legislative, mayoral, and other municipal offices. It's also going to link you to these like detailed pages on each level. It's going to give you party breaks, it's going to give you percentages. So it's going to give you like the mainstay of what's the status of women in politics nationwide. If you go back to that landing page for facts, you're going to see a state-by-state information. Again, probably for this crew, that's going to be one of the more relevant pages. So if I go to any given state, you're going to see the current numbers, in office. You can go to full listings and details, also current and historic data for each state. Again, you can go directly to our database, which I'll show you in a second, if you want to kind of filter it in the way that you think is best. And then probably most helpful, you can look at the representation in terms of percentage and ranking for women in the state legislature by chamber over time back to 1975. So from 1975 to present, you're going to see the summary data. If you go to the database, you're going to get all of the women who've ever served. So you can go at any case, but I'll just take you directly. Actually, I should show you how to get to it from here, which is right here to the Women Elected Officials database. And here's where you can do that search and filter. So if you're looking only in your state, you only want Republican women, you only want them who served in statewide elective office, again, you can filter. If you want to look by race and ethnicity, you can sort and filter by that as well. I'm going to show you another resource in terms of race and ethnicity. So under facts as well, if you go to women office holders by race and ethnicity, here you're going to get, again, a lot more detail for each group nationally, each racial and ethnic group that we include, and we have a kind of detailed statement about how we do these categories and why and where that comes from. And then for each grouping, you're going to see both the current and historic information, again, across levels of office. The database includes those codes as well. For reference, our race codes go back to different years depending on the office. That's all in our methodology because we do self-identified race. And so there are certain levels or people that we won't have race because maybe historically we just don't know. That's going to be especially true at the state legislative level in terms of being able to go backwards in terms of race and ethnicity. So most of that data is pretty solid since the 90s. All right, so the other thing just to check out, again, if we go back to this main facts page, if you go from the facts tab to state legislators, here you're going to get even more detail, women in state legislative leadership. And there are two other resources that I want to point you to that I think are particularly important. So women as a percentage of state legislative caucuses, as I'm going to talk about in terms of the research on women's political power. We know that so much of power is based on whether or not you're in the minority or the majority party. And so a lot of times when folks say, oh yeah, but women are 55% of Democrats in a Republican legislature, right? So you want to know what is women's representation within their party and within the party as it compares to the majority in that state legislature. So this is updated monthly. So it's pretty regularly updated data that gives you a sense of women as a percentage of Democratic legislators and Republican legislators. Again, it's also broken down by chamber. One of the things that comes out of this, which I think is an interesting story that we've talked to a lot of journalists about, is that women are at or over 50% of Democratic caucuses in close to 30 states at this point, but they in no state are really that close to parity or at parity in the Republican Party. All right, so a state like Nevada has the highest, I think, in, if I double check, it might be around 40%. 35.7, yeah, for House. So in any case, so that's another thing to keep track of and be attentive to. And we have one more state-by-state resources that I think you'd find useful, which is representativeness by race and ethnicity. So it's taking census population data of the state and then comparing that to the representativeness of that same group by race and gender in your state. So again, if you wanted to look at in Alabama, you can see the disparities within each racial and ethnic group and how far from representativeness as it pertains to the population that they are in your state. I've mentioned the office holders database. Let me see what else. Then I just wanted to move to, in terms of elections, our election watch page, which just provides you with, again, a host of resources in terms of candidates You can get candidate databases, including state legislative, congressional, and statewide databases that are going to go back in time. This is raw data, so if you have somebody who wants to make a visualization or something, you can get that data here, or you just want to dig down into some of the specific candidates who have run historically. And then this includes also access to our research reports over time for each election. For the current election, our summary is your best place to get the summary information across levels of office, and it's going to compare the numbers of women running and winning to previous years and to previous records. So for example, if you scroll down, you can look at the number of women who are running this year compared to previous years. And then in terms of state legislatures specifically, again, if you go to our election page, our main page here, and scroll a little bit, you're going to see this Women in State Legislative Elections page, which allows you to, again, look state by state over time to see if you've hit or not a kind of record or high since 2000 in terms of the numbers of nominees and the numbers of winners. Obviously, some states haven't held their primary, so when they do, we'll add the nominees number after that. All right, I ran through a lot of that. Oh, I should lastly say, obviously, our research. We're going to get to that. But all of our research reports, our large-scale research reports and analysis are under a research page, which is searchable in and of itself by topic, category of report. I did want to pause there for a second just to see if there was any immediate questions about data or the website. Okay. All right, sounds good. We'll be around too, so if we can be helpful. And you all have the little postcards on your on your tables, and so those will get you just to the main facts page, that QR code. All right, so I'm going to X out of this. So we make the shift from data to the larger scale research projects that we do. And like I said, Rethinking Women's Political Power was the last large scale research project that I worked on. Kira obviously is in the midst of a huge project on gender, money, and politics. And so here we kind of built off of our reputation of being the folks who keep the data, who talk about the numbers of women in politics. But we know that keeping track of women's political representation, specifically the numbers of women in elective office, is just one piece of a larger puzzle to understanding and addressing disparities in women's political power. And so we want to make that distinction much clearer. So to investigate that, we had to bring in some different data that could adequately address the kind of highly complex and diverse circumstances in which women navigate to identify, access, and exercise political power. So we did that in the states. We would argue that state-focused investigation allows us to better analyze the gender and intersectional dynamics that play within what we call state political ecosystems, and we kind of define it here pretty broadly, right, to understand the larger environment, not just, for example, a state legislature in which political power is held and exercised in a state. And then qualitative data obviously helps us move beyond numbers to better understand how power functions within these ecosystems and in different ways for those at diverse intersections of gender, race, and party, which were our three kind of primary axes of analysis. So the report draws on interviews with 192 political actors across 5 states. And so we focused on Georgia, Illinois, Nevada, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania. And we looked at the state of and change in women's political representation from 2010 to 2023. You can see we conducted most of all of our interviews between November 2021 and June 2023. And we included, just to give you a sense of the folks, the actors, current and former elected officials, primarily women, but some men, party leaders, political practitioners, including like staff, consultants, and lobbyists, activists and advocates, and then state-level women's political group leaders. So we really did try to get a more diverse set of voices to really understand how things were looking. We dug deeply into these 5 states, but we chose those states intentionally and based on diverse characteristics that we think help to use these findings to illustrate themes that we both expect and know are also nationwide trends. So it shows the report itself, which is a microsite on the COP website, so it's at rethinkingpower.rutgers.edu. It does so in a way that's really based on the voices of our interview subjects. So it's not really a narrative, a long narrative report, It includes a quotation bank, and then it's really led by literally words and then quotes, right? Like really trying to pair their voices in first-person perspectives. There's also some actual voices you can hear on the site where we got permission to use the audio from our interview subjects. So when it comes to the findings, I'm just putting up all of the key findings here, but I'll walk through some of them with the time we have. We have 5 major themes in the report, each of which constitutes a chapter. Again, I'm not going to walk through the entirety of the report, but I do want to raise a few points that I think are especially relevant and perhaps the most disruptive in how we think, act, and engage in both research and intervention in this area. And those are pretty much focused in the first 3 chapters of the report, so that's what I'm going to talk about. So we lead the report, as is evident in how we titled it, by emphasizing the value of reframing the conversation from numbers to power in evaluating gender parity or disparity in U.S. politics. And so doing so requires us to expand our definitions of power, the measures we use to evaluate women's political power, and the sites on which we focus to increase women's political power. So in our interviews with political leaders, we asked them to tell us where they felt the most power lied in their state. Obviously, answers varied, and often by state, based on the political ecosystems and dynamics and structures that you all function in. The most common responses were those that rejected the idea that political power is concentrated in any one political office, political role, or space. And of course, a lot of folks would say it's definitely not only in elective offices, right? Like there are all these other places and sites for political power, but there is power obviously in holding elective office. And so our case studies show how the power of elected officials also vary by level of office and certainly not in uniform ways nationwide. So the strength of governors, the influence of state legislators, the power of local and municipal office holders, for example, differ across just the 5 political ecosystems that we studied, but surely across the country. And power is allocated unevenly, of course, between legislative leadership, rank and file members, committee chairs, right? So looking within these institutions to see the ways in which power is unevenly divided. And that's often based on the ability or capacity for those particular actors to allocate resources, to set agendas, and to shape culture. Moreover, across all of these spaces, the patriarchal and white roots of these institutions are stubborn, and the motivation to maintain the status quo is strong, even when and where record numbers of women serve. And I think that was we chose Nevada. I know we have Nevadans in the room. We chose Nevada because we had been so often asked about, like, this is the utopia, isn't it? And then we talked to women in Nevada. And so I think that was really something we wanted to make clear, that just because you change who is in this space doesn't mean the space itself and the gendered and racialized dynamics and biases of the place change, and that affects power, right? That affects who has power even if they have representation. And that's why we want to make these distinctions. So to our Nevada friends, again, it's a great example of this. The first state with the majority women legislature, and as Nevada's women political leaders will tell you, that's great, right? Like they will celebrate that and talk about the benefits of that leadership and representation, but a majority woman legislature is not alone proof that power is equal between men and women in the state, including within the legislature itself. So as Assemblywoman Selena Torres told us, there is a system of white male patriarchy in the legislature that permeates regardless of whether or not we're the most diverse legislature. And Senator Dina Neal pointed more specifically to the racial and ethnic bias and dynamics that create inequities in both experience and in influence for Black versus white women, right? So here she was talking specifically about a case where a lobbyist told her she couldn't carry certain pieces of legislation while white women could, right? And so explained to us the limitations and constraints on her own behavior due to those, again, deep-seated biases of both the institution and unelected actors that have a lot of influence in that institution. Finally, our case in Oklahoma presents a clear illustration of how party control undermines power for women in the superminority. So this is a case where in Oklahoma, women are over 50% of the Democratic caucus. So they are well represented in a caucus that is very small and not very powerful. And so being a Democrat in that Republican-dominated space can make the experience, as former Representative Bell told us, feel like quote-unquote martyrdom. This gets to questions as well about retention, right? So do you not only have power within the space, but do you want to keep in that space? So while representation, of course, in elected offices is often used as the proxy for power, so sometimes we use the same language. We say, how powerful are women in Nevada? Well, they have a majority of the seats, so therefore they're very powerful. We want to, again, push back against that and look at these other sites of power and representation, right, even in these unelected roles. So unelected actors like staff, lobbyists, state agency leaders, these folks are in decision-making powers, or decision-making spaces. They derive power from sometimes explicit authority, right, budget authority, policy authority, but as well from knowledge and expertise of the process, established relationships and networks. Sometimes they're involved, when we talk about political practitioners, they're gatekeepers for recruitment, right? Determining who's getting on ballots. Consultants decide who gets to run, because if they're not going to take you on, right, then you may not have the strategic support you need to be successful. So in any one of these roles, right, you can identify how they might be powerful within your state's political ecosystem and the degree to which women and diverse voices are in those spaces. And Kira's going to talk more about donors, so they're on that list too. And we should be attentive, of course, to the power and influence of money, right, in shaping recruitment, success, etc. Oh, I want to say one more thing on this, which is when we were looking at prescriptions and, again, talking to women about their perceptions of power in the state and really giving them, I think, an opportunity to like step back and be like, yeah, what is power? What would that look like here? I want to read from this what they said, what a few of them said to us, which is, power in any role is an illusion if keeping that position requires ceding autonomy. Right? And so you had a lot of women say, it is not powerful to get into a space where I am forced to vote this way, or I am held back from saying this thing. And so that connection between autonomy, authenticity, and power, I think, is important in our conversations about how we understand the progress for women in these spaces and their ability to have an influence, again, in an authentic and autonomous way. I want to be thoughtful of time. So we argue in the second chapter of the report that in order to address gender inequality within political ecosystems, women's lack of political power must be defined as a problem in need of solution. You would think this would be relatively simple, but as many of you have probably observed in your reporting, there are partisan disparities both in and beyond our case states in the degree to which gender disparities in political representation are identified as a problem at all. And so what we found in our interviews, but is true with public surveys and opinion, Republicans are less likely than Democrats to identify systemic and distinct barriers to women's political representation and power. They are more likely than Democrats to cite women's own doubts or preferences as the primary cause for that representation. So the idea like, well, women just don't want to do it, right? Or they don't have the confidence to do it. They are less likely to support or engage in targeted interventions to increase diversity among candidates and office holders. So why are there fewer women's political organizations that are led by and sponsored by the Republican Party or Republican leaderships, right? There is an avoidance of these gender-targeted strategies. And we have a lot of good quotes in the report about folks saying that's not who we are as a party. And then lastly, more likely to doubt that nonpartisan or bipartisan efforts to increase women's political power are meant for or helpful to them. So you'd have women who'd say like, sure, it's a nonpartisan program, but it's not going to serve women like me, right? So those doubts about even the programs that are meant to potentially help them. Here, it's not only an issue of party, though. We also have Democrats and others who have different ways of defining or characterizing the problem, and I'm going to talk about two ways. So for those who believe that the lack of gender parity in political leadership is undemocratic and yields inferior or unfair outcomes, making the case for increasing women's political representation and power is a value proposition. For those who believe that the lack of gender diversity among candidates is bad for party optics or misses opportunities for electoral advantage, making the case for increasing women's political representation is an electoral proposition. And I think we have to be clear about these two things functioning, again, across party. The latter approach, the electoral proposition, has limitations to increasing women's political power. So in these three ways, right? First, increasing women's representation through elections doesn't always yield that concomitant increase in women's political power, especially if the gatekeepers continue to be white men, right? This gets back to constraint. Next, promoting women's candidacies based on their capacity for electoral success relies often on perceptions of electability that have long disadvantaged women of color, especially outside of racially diverse districts. And finally, factors in a political equation, such as political context, voter demand. Obviously, we've seen this since 2018. All of those things can quickly change, while a values-based commitment to increasing gender equity is not time or context bound. So again, this is a question of framing. We have to think about how women's underrepresentation is framed, whether in advocacy or journalism, and we argue in the report that framing gender disparities in political representation and power as a democratic problem, one rooted in the value proposition that gender and racial and ethnic diversity among those in political power is not only fair, but also brings a rich set of perspectives and experiences to politics and overall better outcomes for a greater number or the broadest range of constituencies, all of those things, that offers a more durable and sustainable motivation to increase women's political representation and power, and not only in elected, but also in elected roles and spaces. And lastly, we, in our prescriptions, talk about the importance of just putting women in positions and people of color in positions of political authority, including party leadership, chamber leadership, practitioners, leadership, making sure that we're diversifying those spaces, because those two are deciding how the problem is defined, or if it is defined or noticed at all, right? So who are the folks at those tables in those decision-making spaces? And lastly, I'm just going to talk briefly about a section we have in the report on building support infrastructure. So we asked all interview subjects if a support infrastructure for women exists in their state, and if so, what does it include? We also asked about what's missing in the existing support infrastructures. And so the first thing is our research affirmed, which is not going to be a surprise to folks, that support infrastructures for women in politics are under-resourced and heavily reliant on volunteers. Often the women political practitioners who are doing the work, who are benefiting from those infrastructures, are also the ones fueling that work. So often it's elected women who are like, on the side, I'm going to do this training program, right? So we know that is severely under-resourced. So to address this, we put in a call there for more robust, longer term, and not context-dependent funding for work in this area. In terms of expansion, we also found in all of our interviews, folks said we just need more and different types of support, right? So what does that look like? Expansion is needed in terms of moving beyond campaign preparation and training. There are a lot of campaign training programs, but what can we do beyond that? And so folks cited mental health supports, financial assistance that is not just for campaign donations, but could be for things like childcare or rental support or whatever it is during your time running for office or serving. And then women also talked about the importance of peer-to-peer networks. So how do we support those and create spaces for those that are quite effective? After asking interview subjects if support infrastructure exists for women in their state, we also asked them if they felt that they served all women equally. Again, you won't be shocked that they said no. And so they pointed to various kind of disparities in access to these support networks. So one, the women who are in office are like, you forget about us when we get elected, right? We get elected and then we don't have the same level of support structure that candidates do. So they said we need more of that forward planning support while we're in office. They also told us that more support is necessary for women who are in unelected positions. How do you support staff? How do you support lobbyists? How do you create safe spaces among women in shared groups in those environments? Also, Republican women would say there are more supports for Democrats than there are for us, right? Goes back to what I said before about some of the orientation of party leaders who don't see the need for these gender-targeted programs. But a clear and consistent point made by interview subjects across states was that there were racial and ethnic disparities in the availability and control of support infrastructures for women in politics. And more specifically, with some limited exceptions, the formalized organizations and programs for women in politics at the state level are really rarely specified to serve women at distinct intersections of race and gender. So the Asian, Black, Latina, and Native women that we interviewed pointed to their reliance on informal networks of support primarily, as well as race-based support organizations to go to create that support infrastructure that better served them. Relatedly, in many cases, women's political organizations are led and or resourced by white women, creating conditions under which access to that gender-targeted support depends on the priorities and decisions of white women. And we didn't ask specifically about this. We didn't ask about the leadership of these organizations, but it came up in many of our interviews, particularly with women of color leaders who said there needs to be more discussion about this, right? And it creates challenges for us in terms of accessing these types of supports. So I think this quotation is very long, but I will point to the piece of it that I think is most direct. It's the most overt in the ways in which a community leader, advocate, political practitioner said to us, white women are acting or can act as gatekeepers, especially when there are limited supports available. So as Cecilia raised to her, it's, quote, still a white woman teaching women of color how to be leaders in the community. And so she talked about the curriculum of programs, right, the access to these programs, and how we need to do better about increasing trust and changing the dynamics of who's in leadership in these types of organizations. So it's not just bringing folks to a panel, but changing, again, the power dynamics and distribution of power and influence within the women's political organizations. In our prescriptions, we talk about this as investing in resources, programs, and organizations that serve women at these specific intersections of race and gender, also creating more dialogue and building trust between communities that can ensure that these support infrastructures are serving all women and are uniquely specific to the women who need their support. The final two chapters of the report go through barriers and opportunities, and I'm not going to walk through them. I feel like we often spend these times presenting all the barriers, so I made the choice not to go through all of them, but they're the ones that you know, and they've just come across in the report in ways that I think have a lot of first-person insights into financial, work, family, racial and ethnic biases, all of these things that come through the voices of our interview subjects, as well as the opportunities, the upsides, right? What has caused the increase and allowed for those increases in women in politics across these states. So I hope you'll take a look at those too. And I will stop so that Kira can go through her research, and then if we have a little time, we'll talk a little more about any questions.
So it's so great to be here with you, and thanks for having us. And I'm really excited to share this financial picture with you. Kelly was just talking about some of what we hear on the campaign trail from women about what this space can look like and how it can affect women's opportunities. And so we're just lucky that for the past few years, we've been able to do a research project in this space. We call it the COP Women, Money, and Politics series, and we are working in collaboration with Open Secrets on it. And what it really, where it fits, I think, with the COP's mission and what Kelly has been talking about is in two different ways. The first is the women candidate angle, which is we often hear about money in politics in terms of oh, women may not have the personal resources, they may not have access to the moneyed networks to running for office, they might not have the personal wealth. This is particularly true of women of color candidates. They're not the incumbents. They're usually the non-incumbents. I mean, we do have women incumbents, obviously, and that's a growing number, but most of them are not women, and incumbents have a financial advantage. We hear it in terms of gatekeepers, financial gatekeepers, in terms of who gets that early support and who gets the nod, and then where does the money go. So that's one reason that we are interested in at COP in this space, and we've been doing it through a research project. But the other piece of it is we've always been interested in women's participation generally, not just in terms of candidates. So if you look at our website, you will find information on women voters and historical information on turnout and things like that. And so we know, and as you all know, women outvote men, and they have tremendous potential power at the ballot box. But what we don't know as well is, or as well as we know about voters, is what is the participation of women as donors, as political contributors? Because we know that women are not similarly situated to men in the economy. So we were very interested in getting involved in this research to understand these relationships. And so far, on our research page, we have this growing number of reports. They've mostly been conducted post-election, and we've been looking at states. So we've been looking at statewide executives, like governors. We've been looking at state legislators. And we released a report last year called The Donor Gap, which is one of these tabs. I think it's this one. Yes, which some of you may have seen. And the reason that we use the megaphone image is because it has to do with voice. And we think about financial contributions you could think about it as a form of voice. And so we wanted to ask, right, what role are women playing as donors? And are their voices being heard? And so we called the report The Donor Gap, Raising Women's Political Voices. And what we do in this report is look at 20 years of state data. And we have, I'll let you scroll this at your leisure, but we have some really great interactive it's called Experiences, is my understanding. With our design team, Graphicacy built these incredible pages for us, and we want you to experience it. So you can experience it later today, but if you scroll through it, what you'll see is that most of the money contributed, if you weren't aware of this, is from men to state candidates. And so this is, roughly 2 to 1. Men are outgiving women. And so that's why we decided to call this project The Donor Gap, Raising Women's Political Voices, because we want to spotlight the ways that women are underrepresented in this way in American politics. So we want to really, we hope that you will think about what might be happening in your reporting and whether women's voices are being heard in this respect. If you scroll through, we also have, for most of the states that we're holding state elections in 2022 that were not blanket primary states, what we found across the country in 2022 is that in no state were women giving more money than men. Right? So this is a national situation with women's voices being underrepresented in this way, and we think that this has something to do with who has influence in their state. We also show who women are giving to by party, finding that women are more likely to give to Democrats, as you might have suspected. And then we also look within party, and we find that even within party, there are some gender dynamics there, with women more likely to give to women candidates. So, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. Women candidates seem to mobilize women donors. Women candidates need the women donors to run. And so we point to the possibilities. If more women were giving, we might see more women running, because we definitely think that women candidates are worth the investment. They are formidable fundraisers. When they run, they win. And we show a lot of evidence that women can raise as much as men. So, it depends. We're not arguing that women can't raise money, but we have a more nuanced story about when women can raise the same money as men and where the challenges are. And so we definitely think that raising women's voices as donors is one of the challengers. So that is what we've done in the past. And then what I want to mention is what we're working on right now, which you may have seen. This is our project called the Women, Money, and Politics Watch. So as I said, most of what we've done so far was post-election. This time what we're working on is a periodic deep dive into what's happening in campaign finance from both the candidate side and also the donor side, at the congressional side mostly, but also looking at state elections. And so what we launched last month is this state view. And if you look at this tile map here, we made the decision to focus on 10 states in depth. It's always hard. All the states are equally meritorious. We love all the states. We wanted to, because we were going to go on a deep dive and we wanted to be putting out timely information, we decided to lift up 10, mostly battleground states, to get a really in-depth look. But if you're not on our list, stay tuned. I have an announcement for you in a couple minutes. But for each state, what we've done is we're looking at congressional elections. And so we are showcasing 3 statistics for each state, which is the amount raised, and then the percent of self-financed money. So this is the candidate funding themselves, right, and to what extent. And then we are also lifting up the statistic of average contributions, $200 or less. So those small dollar donations, which candidates are more likely to be using those to fuel their campaigns. And then for each statistic, for each of our states, you can toggle on election type to change the view. And you can look at House and Senate. You can look at incumbent challenger open seat. And then over here, we are providing some analysis of candidate race. And so basically, for each state page, you can get a perspective of how different groups of candidates are doing. Democratic women and men, Republican women and men. And what we've done is frozen this view at where we stood at the FEC deadline of January 31st, so who was running at that time. We're updating this month because we just had another filing, of course, and so we'll be putting that out in a couple of weeks. Another page that we launched last week returns to the theme of donors, and we reprised the megaphone as well. And for this, what we're doing is looking at the voter file and different demographics to try to link the money that you saw on the previous page to where it's coming from in terms of donor demographics. So for each of our states, we are looking at the extent to which women are represented as donors to different types of candidates. So these are men donors and women donors to Republican women running for the Senate in Arizona, for example. And here we can see that strong relationship of party as well. So encourage you to experience our website, interact with the data. This is something that we'll be extending to more states later in the cycle. We also have donor race. And what you can see is from here, as you might have expected, for all candidates, white donors in the state are dominating political giving. But these are the different perspectives that you can get. We also have education and marital status as well. So I guess maybe I'll pause and just say any questions about what we're working on. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Danielle Battaglia. I'm with McClatchy DC. And one of the things I keep running into on the FEC reports is that when I see a woman giving, it's right after I notice that their husband matched out their contributions and then they max out their contributions, and then she gives and max out their contributions, seemingly doubling the allowed contributions they're allowed to give. Does your data at all take into account that as a possibility?
Like sincere giving, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't figure that out with
that's
this, because I
fair.
think you would need probably some attitudinal data to pair with that. So we're just looking at records and names and how that matches up to the voter file. But that's
Okay.
an interesting dynamic.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Jackie. I work with Florida Phoenix, and I've actually relied on some of you guys' data and talked to someone at COP too. But I'm wondering if you guys have done or are maybe looking into any of the budget requests from women lawmakers at the state level. So, like, when they get elected, how much money are they asking for their districts, and are they getting that money for special projects?
That's something that we haven't looked at, but political scientists have looked at. I think mostly at the federal level, but I think probably more recently there's some work at the state level. I mean, there's some evidence that women deliver more to their districts than men on average. I don't know that they've looked at the intersection of race and gender, the study I'm thinking of about congressional finance, but it's something that is important, right? Where is the money going, and who is getting what they want? So I think those are great questions. It's beyond the scope of this project, which is really about donations. Kelly, are you thinking of something else?
I would just say, like, in terms of, I think that's a great point of like a measure we could look at for the impact of women, right, once they're in office. And so the COP research that we've done, that we've collected, that wouldn't be something we collect on a regular basis. Like, we don't collect women's sponsorship on individual bills or budget requests or things like that. As Kira said, a lot of other scholars are kind of doing that as a deep dive study. But we do have past research on the impacts of women that can kind of lead to some of these same answers about, are there distinct types of representation and priorities from women? So we have Kira's previous study with Sue Carroll called More Women Can Run, which is a book-length project, as well as a project on our website about pathways to office, and then our work together with Sue on the impact of women in Congress. That just speaks to the larger questions, but not the specific data on budget.
Hi, I'm April. I'm from Nevada. This is all super fascinating. I can't wait to play, even though we're not one of the 10, but I'm not offended.
Thank you.
You have 100.
I know there's two. I was like, I guess
Yeah.
we're too good. No, this
I don't know if
this is great. Obviously, this shows individual donations that are tied to people. I wonder, is there anything out there that looks at donations from like PACs and different groups? I mean, obviously there are certain political groups like that that are very closely aligned with sort of women's issues or run by women, and obviously those types of donations, you know, are greater as a whole than these. So I'm just wondering if there's any research on that, or I don't know how you would get to it, or if there's anything that we can glean on that information and that side of the political campaign machine.
Yeah, absolutely. So this project, I should have said at the outset, is really focused on individual donors, of course. Represent Women has done research on women's PACs and PACs in general, and the relationship between PACs and women candidates. And Open Secrets has a treasure trove of information on PACs as well. So PACs are certainly extremely important. Individual donations, particularly in primaries, are probably the majority of the funds most of the time. So we think that this is a really important angle. We also have been interested in this because of the relationship between women donors and women candidates, because once you get into the world of PACs, it's harder to know who gave the donations and which candidates it's going to. So we're trying to kind of connect who's giving to which candidates from the public to the candidate, but definitely an important question. I mean, and what we know about PACs is that women have formed their own PACs and donor networks like Emily's List, and those going around kind of the traditional channels has been really important historically for women candidates, right? Finding other ways to mobilize resources on behalf of women.
And one quick question. When did the Rethinking Political Power stuff that you, when did that come out? Because I totally missed it, and I'm like, we were all over that. So I'm just wondering, and what point did that?
It came out in December.
Okay, not
so
that long
maybe it
ago.
was just bad timing.
That's
of
right, yeah.
December. But yeah, so relatively recently, all things considered. And then, and as you saw, like the interviews were anywhere from 2021 to 2023. You all know the difficulties of getting political people to sit down for an hour-long interview. So certainly we did them over time. But yeah, you can.
No, that's recent. In
Recent enough, right? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I'm with Rhode Island Current. Have you or are you guys thinking about tracking at all the relationship between women candidates or elected office holders and campaign finance violations in states? And in Rhode Island, that's something that's sort of become more prevalent just as our campaign finance regulators have stepped up regulations, and it seems like, at least anecdotally to me, a lot of women candidates run afoul of state campaign finance laws because of, like, they don't have a dedicated accountant, or they're also not incumbents who understand how the system works, or like several of them have had health issues, and, like, again, they don't have like someone else running their campaign, it's just them, whereas when men have campaign finance violations, it's like, I spent my campaign money on baseball tickets kind of thing.
We haven't been tracking that, but Daniel, I think I saw you write that down. Potential research project for us.
I'm writing them all down.
Okay.
That was interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the related points to that, I think this has come up actually on our practice side, like so in Ready to Run trainings, like the importance of walking through the nuts and bolts because of this exact point, which is like not, and it's not even women generally, like women from different communities and backgrounds who've taken different paths to office, especially if you're coming maybe from more of an activist advocacy background. You may not have, as you said, like either the networks, the background, especially in the complicated world of campaign finance and rules that change all of the time. And so I know that's been a focus of our colleague Jean Sinstack, who runs our Ready to Run program, to make sure that those conversations are being had about at least who you can go to be sure you're following all these rules. And a secondary piece of that is to remember that women, and again, particularly women of color, are under a microscope in a way that their male counterparts often aren't. And so that the standard, even when it comes, in terms of any sort of violation, right, that there would be most likely more what we would call surveillance of whether or not you are violating any rules, and that itself can be quite gendered and raced in terms of how that process happens. So just thinking about, I don't know if that's the case in Rhode Island, maybe it's across the board, everybody's getting equally.
At least supposedly it is. They have a more robust audit system generally.
Sure. But it is something to be attentive to in terms of, like who's being talked about publicly about it, who's being punished for it, what's the accountability mechanism look like?
I think that what also feeds into this is that women are held to a higher standard, right?
Yeah.
So there's this expectation that women are not corrupt, and they're not. And so if there's any fall, it's a pretty hard fall, and that adds to the dynamic.
Sorry.
And just to round out my part of the presentation, this part of the analysis that I showed you that we launched last week, we find in 8 of the 10 states that men are providing about 60% of money to congressional candidates and women 40%. And in the other 2 states, Colorado and Massachusetts, it's about half and half. And in Massachusetts, actually, that data is only to Democratic candidates, very blue state. And at that time, there weren't any Republicans who had campaign filing yet. The Senator Warren, she now has an opponent. And then in terms of this project, in mid-May, we'll be launching some analysis of state legislative and statewide elections for we'll have data for 5 states at that time. It should be Georgia, Massachusetts, New Mexico, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Some grouping there. And then in the summer, we're going to build out to all states for congressional elections. So stay tuned for that. We're going to extend what we've been doing for the congressional races here to all states so that you'll be able to look by state to see how different candidate groupings are raising money, Democrat men and women versus Republican men and women. And then in the summer or maybe early September, we're going to be extending the demographic analysis to the 50 states, and we'll be pooling data from across the country for congressional races and going deep on the candidate side to try to understand how different subgroups of candidates by gender, party, race are raising money from different demographic groups. So that's what's coming up. And I guess any other questions for either of us?
Hi, I'm Maya. I cover Nebraska for USA Today. I'm curious about the breakup of the individual donors in terms of we know that men donate more money than women do, but is there a larger number of men that donate compared to women, or is it like there are more women donating but they make smaller contributions, and then there are just like a handful of men but they make larger contributions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that you can toggle between in both the donor demographics for this current project and in the donor gap, you can toggle between percent of money and percent of contributors. And so women are better represented as contributors in terms of percent of people involved. For the release we just did about Congress, what we find is that women are disproportionately represented as smaller dollar donors. They are less well represented in 1,000 plus to congressional candidates donations, and so the fact that women are participating more than is showing up in terms of the money that is given, this speaks to their smaller contributions and probably has something to do with earnings and wealth and other things. So there is a disconnect there, and you can look at both stats on our website.
I wanted to jump in, and I'm told to address the camera when I do this, so I'm not being rude. Is a lot of the activity that we're seeing of late from women like Mackenzie Scott and Melinda Gates and all of the women at that level who have these enormous sums of money, but it appears to me that they are making an effort to bring other women to the table or identify other sources of female funding. Could that have an impact in the coming years on the political scene?
This project is actually funded by Pivotal Ventures, in fact. So I hope, so to answer your question, I really hope that this project will have the impact. So I mean, that's kind of indirectly her having an impact. What we're really trying to do, as I said, is put facts out there for all of you to run with, and we really want to lift up the problem of this relationship between women, money, and politics, right? Because that affects who gets onto the ballot, whether they can succeed. We spend a lot of time talking, I think, about women candidates need to run, but I would say, and they also need resources to be successful in their campaigns, and so I think that Pivotal Ventures has been really important to helping us make this work possible. It makes this work possible, and I think my colleague wants to add something.
So I think what you're seeing now is sort of a new era of a certain kind of philanthropy from women who have the means to give at these levels. And I think they're doing their work and using their resources in two ways. I don't know about Mackenzie Scott, but I do know that Melinda Gates gives to individual candidates, right, as a person, but then she is investing her money through an organization like Pivotal Ventures in a very clear way about how to sort of lift up the whole field. And the hope, of course, is that at the same time she is engaging other women who have that kind of capacity for giving to do this kind of institutional lifting of organizations who are doing the work, whether it's research work or activist work. And I have to say, I've been doing this work for over 40 years, and I honestly never thought I would see the day that there would be a woman with those resources who would prioritize not just women's political equity, but thinking about how to lift up women across sectors, which is what Pivotal Ventures is doing. So I'm hoping that this is a new era of women in philanthropy who are kind of looking at these institutions through this gendered lens and thinking about how can they lift up women's voices across sectors.
Well, this has been an incredibly powerful foundational conversation for me, particularly for women in journalism who are looking for ways to add depth and value to the coverage and taking it away from that horse race sort of approach to covering politics. So I am very grateful to Kelly Dittmar and Kira Sanbon-Matsu for joining us today, and I'd like us to take this opportunity to show our thanks to them.
Thanks for having us.